What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Dread Delusion, an indie open-world RPG that released back in May that a lot of people were asking me to check out due to its very unique setting and interesting story. Now, at the time this game released, I was honestly quite busy, but I knew I wanted to circle back to it when I got a chance, and I had a small opening before the release of Black Myth Wukong, so I decided to sneak it in there. Which was probably the right thing to do, because very recently, back in July, Dread Delusion received what the developer called its final update, which added things like hard mode and some extra content as well. Now, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below to a video that goes over everything I cover, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. And it's probably important to mention in the case of Dread Delusion that while on launch some of the achievements were apparently bugged, everything is working now, and I didn't really have any trouble with it outside of one, which requires you to craft an elixir that, for whatever reason, I had to craft a lot of elixirs before it actually worked. But with that out of the way, let's get into this thing. So as I mentioned, technically speaking, this is an open world RPG, but compared to most anything open world, it's relatively small in scope. A full run of this thing is probably going to be somewhere between 15 and 30 hours for you, depending on how much messing around you do. But it's worth a mention that this game does have some replayability to it, as there are quite a few quests and things that have multiple outcomes, but you yourself are bound by a single save file, which isn't a decision that I love, but it is what it is, especially because this game does not really have a huge emphasis on, say, combat or challenge, so forcing you to not be able to re-roll something, I suppose, is just a little unnecessarily constricting, to me at least. But ultimately, I would say probably due to the aesthetic more than anything else, this game received a lot of comparisons to something like Morrowind, and after having played this game fully, I will say that that is not a comparison that really holds up beyond the visuals. But I still had a really great time with this game, and I want to get into some of the why and the what. First up, let's start with the technical state of this one. It's my understanding that when this game launched, it was quite buggy. However, all the way here in August, things seem to have been mostly cleared up. I really didn't run into any issues at all, outside of the occasional clipping here and there, but that was really pretty much it. However, given the state this game launched in, from what I understand, it might be worth remembering that it is possible to have more issues than I did, so definitely bear that in mind. Which brings us to the difficulty section. Now, very recently, this game received a hard mode, so there is normal mode and hard mode. The differences are mostly that on normal mode, the game is frankly very, very easy. Enemies deal very little damage to you. You don't have to fight them at all to begin with, to be honest. And potions and supplies are very abundant. The recently added hard mode, however, scales some of that back. Enemies deal more damage. Health potions and whatnot are much less readily available. Ingredients to craft them yourself are less available. And so you have to be much more careful about engaging with enemies directly. However, pretty much all of the game allows you to just skip that. You don't have to engage in much combat at all, which makes hard mode, I would say, much more fitting for something like a pacifist route, where you avoid as much combat as possible. But overall, it's just not a terribly challenging game in general. But that does bring us to character creation. So it's important to note that this is first person and you're not going to see your character or anything, but character creation allows you to customize some of your initial stats. And we do this by determining what our character was prior to being locked up in prison. Now, each of your initial sort of backgrounds that you will pick give you a +2 to one of your 4 attributes. This is a significant boost to those, so do choose wisely here, as each of these stats affects things like how easy it is to lockpick, how quickly you can move, how much stamina, health you have, etc., and also some derivative stats. Now, after that, you pick your profession. This is going to give you a +2 secondary stats like attack, lockpicking, lore, or charm. These are important because these 4 choices make up your 4 sort of primary routes around any given problem. Now, you won't necessarily be able to use any one of these in every situation. In fact, some things only really have one solution, and you either have the skill for it or you don't, but each of these represents a path around a problem, either picking a lock, investigating things with lore, understanding how magic works, charming your way through a person who might be blocking your way, or simply killing something. Now, it's important to note that each of them has their limitations, though, which we'll get into. Now, your next choice after this is the reason that you are in prison, with, again, each of these representing a secondary stat. Afterwards, though, we find ourselves released from prison by a High Inquisitor, which starts the story. So the story of this game is one of its strong points, and I'm going to try to go out of my way here not to actually spoil anything, despite this review coming a few months after the game itself, because, again, I think the story is quite strong here, and I really enjoyed engaging with it, but there are a few things I want to talk about. Now, right away, with this being an indie game, almost none of this is voice acted. There's a little bit of voice acting in the beginning, and the endings are voice acted, but that is pretty much it. But let's talk about the story, starting with a little bit of world building. So we are in prison by the Apostate Union, which are a collective of people that went to war with another group called the Wiccans, who worshipped these gods. The gods themselves were very powerful and often made bargains with humanity, which did in fact help them in some ways, but usually came with some very big detriment. The Union hated this, killed all the gods, and made worshipping them illegal, which is, I would say, probably the big primary thing to know in terms of the world building, but there is some other stuff as well. For starters, the entire world lives upon what they call the Sky Realms now. We are in a very specific area of the Sky Realms, a sort of archipelago, if you will, floating in the air. And the world lives this way because down on the surface, which they call the Underlands now, the Emberians, 400 or so years ago, caused the destruction of the surface of the planet in an event that they call the Worldrend. And now, remnants of their civilizations are scattered all below down there, as well as on various floating islands around. But these days, everyone's doing their best to get by, but the land is largely cruel and unforgiving. Now, as I mentioned, we found ourselves in prison only to be released by the High Confessor, their name actually is, who is bound up in this iron coffin thing. They explain that we can sort of try to earn our freedom by performing a task for them, because the Union has met with extreme resistance in this fringe archipelago by a fugitive that they're after known as Vela. In fighting your way to Vela in the little prologue area, you set up the rest of the story where she ultimately escapes, but you yourself are named as a confessor as well, and allowed to attempt to track down Vela in exchange for your freedom and your life. In order to do that, you're going to have to travel around the Sky Realm here in order to track down 3 of her prior associates who are going to help you find her and put a stop to whatever she's up to. But very unsurprisingly, what she is up to winds up being a much more grander tale about the very nature of these realms and the power that they have in themselves, as well as what happened to the world all those years ago. Now, that's as much as I really want to say to avoid spoilers, but again, I thought the narrative was really well done. A lot of these characters are very well written and interesting, and we'll talk a bit more about that world building in the gameplay and world section specifically. But honestly, I think just the story would have been enough to get me to play through this. Though for now, that does bring us to our progression systems. So progression in Dread Delusion comes down to 2 primary things and then some secondary stuff. Now, the primary thing are your delusions. As you explore and complete quests, you'll be either finding or rewarded with what they call glimmers of delusion, these floating blue skulls. Every time you find so many of these, you effectively level up and you're allowed to increase one of your 4 primary attributes, thus increasing all of its derivative skills, allowing you to clear higher and higher checks to find your way around problems and do more with side quests. You won't be able to max out everything, but if you play it smart, you can do almost everything with a single character, but there will be some stuff you simply cannot do or approaches you cannot take. You should be able to max out 2 of these stats with about half or so in a third one. So you won't really be able to max out everything, but that won't necessarily limit you from doing much. Now, the other part of this is upgrades and gear. So you'll find all sorts of gear as you explore the Isles, including armor, helmets, trinkets, weapons, etc. So weapons naturally determine how you attack. These are pretty much melee or ranged. Armor is much more varied. It determines, of course, how much armor you actually have, how much damage you'll take from incoming hits, but it can also have secondary effects like boosting up one of your stats, and that combined with certain buffs from other things can help you clear checks you otherwise would not be able to make, which is the same case for things like rings or accessories you can find. find. Now, your armor and weapons can be upgraded. This, of course, improves how good they are, but requires ever-increasing amounts of ore, which is divided up into its own tiers. Now, the final tier, for weapons specifically, allows you to create a sort of different version of that weapon. So, for instance, there are 3 different variations of what that weapon could become, which will kind of help determine what kind of special effect you want it to have, but the ore you need to do those transformations don't really come until the very end of the game, or the last leg of it, I should say. But it's important ultimately to keep your gear upgraded, as you would imagine, both for stat buffs and simply to make combat easier. Now, the other type of progression here, that secondary stuff, is knowledge and exploration. So in lieu of just a straight up map in this game, you get a map that you yourself have to fill out. Going to locations and marking down where they are in your map highlights and explores the map for you, and you can jot down landmarks and turn this in to the scholars who gave you the ability to do this in the first place, which then opens up a quest to activate some teleporters around to take you to any of the 4 primary areas of the main archipelago. You can also find like mirrors and stuff you can activate that will instantly transport you between places as well. So there's a lot of secondary progression in terms of how easy it is to get around, which in fairness the Morrowind fans will likely enjoy. Though that does bring us to the gameplay and world section. Another place that this game really shines is the exploration and the world building. So this is open world, and the map itself is divided up largely into 4 different areas that you have to find your way through, starting with the introductory area. So after the prologue, there's a small area that you have to run through first that will kind of help you get your feet wet with the game and introduce you to a lot of its core concepts, including things like its day-night cycle and how that plays into quests and how people move around, and how you can access the other areas, because each individual area of the map is sort of its own little kingdom, if you will, which requires things like a passport or other quests in order to access those different areas. So you kind of have to learn how to get through these checkpoints or bypass them in order to get to the next area, which pushes you to explore even more. Now, in each of those kingdoms, you can even buy your own house and sort of customize it as well to give yourself a little home base in whatever area you wind up liking the most, or simply all of them, of course. But let's talk a little bit about these kingdoms. Now, the first one you enter is just a little local area called Quill, I guess, where they harvest mushrooms that can help you see the future, and you can get involved in their local struggles. Just south of this is an area called Hallowshire, a place that is struggling with a famine that the Union doesn't really want to help anybody with, it would seem. So you have people struggling with their hunger, obviously, but also turning to old gods in order to try to do something, anything about the fact that they're starving to death. And you can get involved in all that, and this place is heavily controlled by the Union as well. Now, just to the left of this is an area called the Kingdom of the Endless, an entire kingdom of effectively immortal people. However, they are not immune to aging. So their bodies are in active states of rot and despair. However, even when their body fails, they do not truly die. They just become a sort of incorporeal consciousness, able to witness but not able to act. And all of these people secretly yearn for death because of how long they've been alive, which is its own interesting thing. But to the right side of the map, you then also have the Clockwork Kingdom, which, after the fall of the gods, decided to make their own technological version, in a sort of act of man-made hubris. So there's a lot going on in terms of the world here, and I think they managed to really nail a lot of what makes a game interesting and fun to explore, because around every corner is some new thing to get lost in, and a lot of the side quests really exemplify that. There's not really a lot of fat there. Just about every side quest explores some elements of this and really digs into the creepy, weird side of this stuff, while also presenting you with more information about how this world works, which I thought was great. Now, what's more, after you've been everywhere and you progress to a certain point in the story, you will get access to an airship to more quickly navigate each of these areas, as well as find some standalone islands off on the fringes of the map that will let you experience even more unique content before you wrap the game up. Now, all throughout those adventures, there are 4 primary ways past any given problem: lore, lockpick, charm, or might. So lore allows you to investigate and interact with certain objects to find secrets. These can do things like open alternative routes or simply unlock doors for you, which can be useful to access certain things. Then there's lockpicking, pretty straightforward. Now, whereas lore is a simple pass or fail system based on your value, lockpick you can always do, but how good you are at it determines your chances of success on a D6 roll. So the more lockpick skill you have, the lower that D6 requirement becomes, and thus how probable it is you'll actually manage to pick the lock. And then how many lockpicks you can have on you is determined by your thief skill as well. Then there's charm, another pass or fail system, pretty straightforward, your ability to talk people into doing what you want, which can allow you to bypass all sorts of stuff. Now, I will say most of the charm checks you can get simply by having around 40 or so charm, but there are a few things beyond that you have to have much higher charm for, including an alternate version of the end. And then lastly, we have might. There are some doors and things you can simply bash down if you have enough might. So overall, I just think the map system is really cool. I loved exploring and kind of learning how this world worked. I thought the world itself was incredibly interesting. And I think they really nailed the world building of this one. Now, just because I didn't know where else to throw it, there is also an alchemy system. You'll be like picking up all sorts of ingredients and consumables, etc. And you can spend those via alchemy in order to, of course, make potions and the like, though all of that is color-coded, so if you see something red, it's probably related to your health, blue is mana, etc. But remember, on hard mode, this is very much so reduced. Now that brings us to the combat. Now, as much as I liked pretty much everything else about this game, combat is where this game struggles for sure. The system is just too simple, and while hard mode kind of seeks to address that a little bit, it doesn't really make up for the core problem, I would say. Now, combat is largely divided up into melee, ranged, and magic, as tends to be the usual, but all of that can pretty much be avoided if you have the skills to do so. Now, melee is pretty much just running up and hitting things with your weapon. As you'd imagine, you can charge up attacks to deal extra damage at the cost of more stamina, of course, and if you lean into might, which gives you more melee damage, it's a very easy way to play the game, especially if you're just on normal, because enemies just don't deal a lot of damage to you, and running up and smacking them real quick, if you want to fight them at all, is typically a pretty easy way to go. Now, this is probably an important time to mention that even if you run up to enemies, it's usually pretty easy to also just run around them and outrun them because they don't follow you very far. Now, you do have some ranged options, primarily in the form of thrown weapons, but a little later into the game it is possible to get like an actual bow. But I would say things like shurikens and throwing daggers are going to be more common here, which can be dipped in poison and the like, if you want to take that route. Now, we also have access to magic and spells. How many of these you can have equipped at any given time is down to your magic skill, and how long it takes to cast them is also down to your magic skill. Now, you have your standard offensive spells like fireballs, magic lances, and stuff, but there's also a lot of utility things like there's a spell that can turn you invisible, there's some summoning stuff, and a couple of other interesting things. But probably the most useful, honestly, are just the ones that allow you to quickly teleport from one place to another, or heal yourself, or turn enemies against each other via the entice skill, though that does have its own limit by how much your entice skill actually is. So there's a little bit of everything, but again, relatively limited in scope. Now, basically every form of combat is determined by your stats, though. So how much melee damage you deal comes down to how much might you have and how upgraded your weapons are. Your spell damage and potency comes down to your spellcast skill, but also your lore skill, which governs how much mana you have to cast to begin with. So there's some extra things to know, but really nothing crazy. Now, all in all, that makes for a system that is a little bland, I would say, which is fine. I think the game has other better, stronger points, but combat is easily avoided if you don't want to do it at all. When you're in combat, there's not really much to it outside of spamming whatever your chosen method of attack is, and that never really changes throughout the game. There's also not a ton of enemy variety, though they do try to mix that up a little bit and introduce a couple enemies later on that you haven't seen elsewhere, or variants of earlier enemies as well, but don't expect anything too crazy in that regard. So, truth be told, I just think combat as a system compared to everything else is unlikely to capture your interest. And honestly, towards the end of the game, I was just running past things to avoid combat because usually it just wasn't worth the time, and it's not like the enemies posed any threat anyway. Now that does bring me to the Steam Deck section. Honestly, pretty straightforward one here. Runs great on the Steam Deck. It does have a verified rating. The requirements for this game are very low, so no problems in terms of FPS and everything. It has controller support, cloud saves, everything you'd want. perfect game to play on the Steam Deck, really. So definitely a good option for you. Which brings us to our positives and negatives. So on the positive side for me, I would say definitely the story, the environment, the exploration of that environment, and the world building. I think that's where this game shines the most. Now, because of its relatively limited systems, there are times where it can fall a little short. For instance, there is a reputation system in-game, but it doesn't really seem to matter much outside of being able to access a few different rooms here and there, or like some amenities for those factions, but it doesn't really change much elsewise. But in spite of that, I still had a lot of fun with it. Now, on the negative side of things, we do have some issues here. I would say combat is the biggest one. Even on hard mode, it doesn't really alleviate that, given that you can just either avoid combat altogether or simply run past enemies with no real consequence. And then things like the single save file are, honestly, in my opinion, just a little unnecessary. It doesn't really seem to add anything to this game. And while I'm not opposed to it as a mechanic, it's just that in this specific game, it really doesn't seem to do anything for the experience. It's unnecessary. And then there's just sort of general limitations, like, for instance, you can't really kill quest NPCs or anything. So if the obvious solution to a problem might be to just kill someone, that is not an option most of the time unless they are just already hostile. To give an example, there was a castle where I needed to get past a door, and the character who was blocking me was in a faction that I was opposed to and hated by, but I simply couldn't fight this guy for the key or whatever past this door. I had to pass a charm check or a lore check, and there were no other options. So it's moments like that where you can really feel the game's limitations. So while the game is offering choice and consequence, and there are multiple endings and everything, it doesn't quite manage to nail that feeling, because sometimes what I would consider just obvious solutions are simply not possible. Though that does bring me to my conclusion. Dread Delusion is, I would say, a delightfully weird game. It is $20 over on Steam, which I did pay for, and for $20, I had a pretty great time with this, considering its scope of development and everything. So if things like the art style and gameplay don't put you off, I think this is well worth your time, with the understanding that as an indie game, it does not quite nail the execution of everything it is trying to do. And if combat is especially important to you, or voice acting matters to you, then it might not quite land for you as well as it did for me. But otherwise, in spite of a few flaws, I had a great time with this one, and I hope others will as well. So that is pretty much where I'm going to wrap up this particular review. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But most importantly, let me know what you think about this one down in the comments section below. Regardless of any of that though, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.